As we can usually see in the media, the two sides regularly claim kill counts of various equipment during the war, but do not release their own losses. It's very likely that both of these lists, published by the armed forces of respective countries, are exaggerated. Some purposefully, but also because it's just damn hard to verify stuff in the chaos of war. Throughout history, a perceived hit would often be reported as equipment kill, while in fact a lot of those hits would result in repairable vehicles. There are organizations like the Oryx which try to document photos of destroyed equipment, providing a somewhat objective method and potentially more precise figures. But said method is subject to incompleteness and erroneous image attribution. Generally, Russians will photograph Ukrainian losses and Ukrainians will photograph Russian losses. One can see that these figures based just on images are far different. As a side note, it's worth mentioning that the said image depository differentiates between destroyed, abandoned and captured vehicles. The figure of losses is an aggregate of all those. Anyway, Binkov won't use just that list either. Instead, we will also guesstimate the hardware losses using a modifier figure from one of our previous videos. Basically, we'll take actual claims about killed personnel from the past, compare those with NATO and Pentagon estimates on the same date, then use those ratio values on May the 2nd personnel claims, and finally use those modifiers on actual hardware losses claims from May 2nd. That method suggests Russian hardware losses on the final list are equal to 62% of the Ukrainian claims, and that Ukrainian hardware losses are equal to 50% of the Russian claims. Applying said percentages would suggest the following losses in hardware for both sides. But we can't stress enough how imprecise this method still is. It could very well be that it's still off by dozens of percent on either side. Still, in some regards, it more or less matches the Oryx image documented losses of the Russian side. When it comes to stuff like Ukrainian planes, it's plausible Oryx photos can't capture most of the Ukrainian planes lost on the ground, as those would be out of reach to people wanting to photo document them, so Binkov's list might be more precise when it comes to those. Both sides are going to publish fewer photos of their own losses. Thus, photos of Ukrainian equipment might be understated compared to Russian ones. That's because Russia clearly lost more equipment on the front line without managing to take said front line and afterwards photograph all the Ukrainian losses. Still, if one would once again interpolate the two lists, the Oryx one and Binkov's own estimate, hardware losses as of May the 2nd might look something like this. Certain items like aircraft Ukraine lost should still be understated here. All these losses, if remotely true, would mean that both sides, and especially Russians, still have the majority of their equipment inventory intact. Russians are more in danger of running out of troops than equipment. And if any side suffers enough losses, they will lose the will to fight. Historically, there are examples of 10% losses that routed armies, but also examples where almost 50% losses still did not cause a rout. Certainly though, given the actual reports of morale issues, the latter figure doesn't seem very applicable in the current Russian situation. When it comes to aircraft, it seems the Ukrainian planes that do remain operational are also lacking airstrips, improvised or other, to operate from in numbers. And percentages that were shown apply to the overall fleet, including support planes and everything. It's more than likely that combat aircraft have suffered more, perhaps even well over 50% of their total inventory. Likewise, as basically all Russian plane losses are combat planes downed over Ukraine, it's likely Russia lost close to 6% of their overall tactical combat plane inventory. Ukraine has little means of engaging either high-flying Russian planes or artillery pieces far behind their front lines. Its stocks of such weapons like the S-300 missiles or various artillery are getting slowly attrited, and what the West was sending to Ukraine until recently was carefully chosen not to include such items. On the other hand, numbers of soldier-launched anti-tank weapons sent so far are impressive and have possibly eclipsed the numbers Ukraine had before the war. While the lists shown are not exhaustive and many other systems might have been sent, on April 8th the Pentagon did disclose the total numbers sent by that time, both by US and its allies. It's evident the anti-tank list above is somewhat close, while the anti-aircraft list is grossly underreported. It can very likely be said that without this massive influx of military aid to Ukraine, the situation on the front would be different, with Russia suffering fewer losses and Ukraine suffering greater losses than they did up until now. True scale of the West's military aid to Ukraine may not be known for years. The British Starstreak not only provides somewhat longer reach than usual manpad missiles, but it can also be used against lightly armored vehicles. US Switchblade 300 loitering munition is also a step in a direction that Ukraine might need. And in recent weeks, the Western countries started to send a deluge of heavy vehicles like tanks, armored personnel carriers and artillery, with several hundred promised so far. The list shown includes both the systems sent since the start of the war and systems announced but still not in Ukraine. By receiving airplane parts, or perhaps even planes in parts, Ukraine is managing to keep some of its air force still active. The UK is sending whole vehicle systems with Starstreak missiles. Artillery in particular might be quite important to Ukraine right now, and the West is starting to send even some of the bigger guns. The list shown is not exhaustive. The UK, for example, is also preparing a shipment of artillery pieces of undisclosed type. Perhaps crucially, Canada confirmed it's shipping GPS-guided Excalibur rounds for its guns. US did not disclose if it is sending such rounds. To make the most out of artillery, systems like drones and firefinder radars are also being supplied. Again, the list shown is likely not exhaustive. Many Bayraktar drones have been spotted in Ukraine since March. Perhaps more importantly, US RQ-20 drones are on the way as well. The US announced it was also sending laser-guided rockets, which will most likely be APKWS. A few years ago, those were being tested launched from a truck. A laser guided by RQ-20 drones, they could deliver fairly potent and precise punches, similar to mortar systems in range and payload. Besides the additional Bayraktar TB2 drones, Ukraine is also using domestically developed Punisher drones. Like the RQ-20, they are very small, simple battery-powered drones, slow and quiet, thus hard to detect. They use other drones to navigate to target before ejecting a small bomb. Perhaps just as important as all this hardware is both UK's and US admission that they are sharing intelligence data with Ukraine. So satellites and sensor planes flying just alongside Ukraine's border are being used quite a bit. Ukraine is likely fairly well aware of any large-scale movements of Russian ground formations or deeper incursions of Russian air power into Ukraine. Given the limitations of Russian air power, the depth of Ukrainian territory and the very long border to monitor with EU countries, it's unlikely Russia could actually track and destroy various trucks sending in individual weapons over the border. Indeed, recent Russian attacks near Lviv and Odessa targeted depot facilities where Russia alleges Ukraine stored some weapons from the West. Targeting such locations would be easier than tracking individual trucks. Still, just how dispersed those Ukrainian weapon depots are is hard to say. Russia is likely only scratching the surface of what's being brought into Ukraine with such attacks. Russian-owned replacement equipment is likely to come from refurbished ex-Soviet stocks, as new or deeply modernized vehicles take too long to be produced. Still, given that previously scheduled production is ongoing, a fair part of Russian equipment can be replaced that way too. It's evident that the West has gotten bolder with its arms transfers to Ukraine. Now that it's clear the war may last for months or more, even more complex weapons that require long training are sent to Ukraine, which all likely infuriates Russia. Will Russia try to somehow escalate or retaliate if the West continues sending hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces remains to be seen. But Russia's options are quite limited.